Hello everybody, this is GM Jesse Kraai, and today I'd like to discuss a rather simple system against the Gruenfeld which can pose black some good practical problems. The Gruenfeld is a very good opening, and in particular we've seen Kamsky play it with good success recently. And in general, what we're finding in the chess world is that any move order, any opening that black plays that has just some logical consistency behind it, following opening principles, is actually going to be okay. There was a time in chess when we used to think the Gruenfeld was a little suspicious, maybe the King's Indian too, but they're really all logical openings, and as such they always seem to prove their resilience. And that's also the case with what I'm going to show today, but I'm hoping really to provide you an easy-to-learn system that can present your opponent with some problems. Okay, let's begin by taking this pawn and playing e4, bishop g7, knight f3. So let's talk a moment about this position. There's some basic positional dynamics that are going on here. One of the reasons this opening was considered suspicious was just that black seemed to lack a little bit of central control. But black really have nice fighting possibilities, of course, with c5, and all his pieces really are going to logical squares, all his minors in any case. And so what we can say here is that it's going to be black's job to disrupt somehow this center. White's job, on the other hand, is going to be to try to hold the center together and to use both the space advantage to attack the king and the space advantage to block off some of black's pieces. For example, the bishop hitting the pawn. If we can make that bishop bad, that's a good thing. Okay, so in particular, we're going to be looking to play d5 at some point. And let's talk about this move d5 when we look at an inaccurate move order first by black. Now, usually c5 is played by the top people, but castles, it's hard to see why this move is a little bit inaccurate. And the reason is this. We can now play bishop e2, c5, and castles. And black really isn't in time to give us grief with knight c6 because now d5 works. The tactical point is bishop takes c3, bishop h6, and white has an advantage. For example, bishop a1, queen a1, knight d4, knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes. And of course, if f6 will just take the rook, and we have a very pleasant position. And black can try to keep the rook with e5, but this position is very pleasant for white. For example, something like rook f7, rook b1, and white is clearly better because of the weakness of the king and the ability of this pawn to advance. So, let's go back a second. What we saw in that variation was really white being able to get in the move d5 in an effective way. And like I said, it's going to be black's obligation to try to stop that. And that's why this move c5 is played immediately by black. So let's take a look and look at the more exact move order. I gave a couple more variations of that in the PGN file too. So c5. Now, I think the most testing move here, seen in GM practice, is this move rook b1, which is a little bit of a freaky move because we're not really threatening the pawn yet on b7, and it's not really clear that the rook wants to be on b1. But we are getting out of the way and preparing the strategical goal of someday playing d5. And this position is, I would say, the topical one of play. And if you decide that you want a new option after you see this lecture, then rook b1 is something to think about. And I actually might do a lecture on rook b1 soon. But first, I want to take a look at this move, bishop b5, which is very interesting and holds some dangers for black. It's also very simple to understand. We're really just developing our pieces, and we're going to castle soon. And it's still going to be black's job to stop us from consolidating in the center. Now, the most often played move in this position really isn't that hot, and that is bishop d7. Bishop d7 is not so good because now rook b1 makes a lot more sense. Okay, let's take a look here. The point is now the rook has at least now a target, and we're going to find that this trade of bishops will kind of help white consolidate the center. Think about it this way, is that the bishop, the light square bishop, didn't really help us defending this pawn. Whereas this bishop on d7 normally wants to go to g4 to attack the knight, which supports this pawn. So we're really trading off that piece, and this will make it easier to hold down d4 and to keep that bishop on g7 out of the game. So, for example, one way for black to play would be queen a5, takes, knight takes, and now simply castles. We have a nice threat on b7, and it's not so easy for black to play. If, for example, b6, then queen b3, and I think it's important to say here that what's happening is we are using our space advantage now to hurt the black minor pieces. Notice this pawn dominates the black knight on d7 because it takes away those squares, and it dominates this bishop. So a sample variation could be something like this. Castles, e5. So I'm threatening to bust up the black position with e6. Let's say black plays e6. Now knight d2 is a strong move. We could then maybe see pawn takes, rook a c8, knight e4, with a very pleasant position for white. We're going to come into d6, and we can say that this is an advantage for white. So another response could be, let's say, knight b6. But I still think queen b3 is a good move. For example, pawn takes, castles, bishop a3 is a pleasant position for white. And even if we put it on e3, I think it would also be pleasant. Let's say castles, bishop e3. And notice really that by controlling the center, we're putting this bishop out of the game, and this pawn will always be a cause of a little bit of grief for black. And right now he has to think about dc to win that pawn on b7. So a pleasant advantage for white in this variation.